Chapter 12. I told you to be careful, Hannah said, removing a handkerchief from her sash to wipe his bloody nose. He appeared to be regaining his strength, but only food, drink, and sleep would truly replenish his energy. It will pass, she replied, referring to the infection. He tried to stand, but swayed back to the ground, Hannah attempting to help with his balance. Deciding he was unable to stand, Sierre moved his legs beneath him and took a seated position on the road. Why did you come? I heard the explosion, and I don't know. I felt you were in trouble. Sierre shook his head and looked to the ground before a grin appeared. You shouldn't have left, though even I cannot deny I would more than likely be dead if you hadn't have shown up. Hexfer would have no qualms in killing me. Who is the other man? The one in the onyx cloak? Hannah questioned, unconsciously switching her gaze to the spot he had stood before. I'm uncertain of his identity, but he and Hexfer have been allied for quite some time. I can tell that much. Also, I can only assume the guild has no idea of their alliance, nor that this man is helping their cause. For I know if they knew, they would reject his assistance. Sierre looked up at the clear sky, and he took in a deep breath. Hannah glanced down at his ring, which appeared to be gaining vibrancy once more. The image of the onyx-cloaked sorcerer seemed to be permanently displayed in her head, just as the image of Hexfer had been when she first saw him. However, Sierre's statement confused her more than clarifying the situation. Why would the guild reject help from him? There are stories of sorcerers wearing black robes committing acts of dark magic. In other words, forbidden magic. Even within the ranks of sorcerers, there is a caste system and a group which they themselves oppress. The guild refers to these practitioners as reapers, and try their best to keep this group separate and distinct from their own. The rights and equality for which they press do not apply to the reapers. Due to their names, reapers are often hired by high-ranking members of society, such as nobles or royalty, to do their dirty work. Like assassination? Hannah asked. Sierre nodded. Hannah's mind flooded with her thoughts. She pictured these reapers killing innocents, being responsible for incidents much like Wickborough faced, incidents that kept the townspeople fearful of sorcerers. And yet, the onyx-cloaked sorcerer, another reaper if Sierre was correct, emitted no ominous or hostile presence. Sierre continued. It is said a man of the shadows was seen by castle officials on the night of the king's death. Many sorcerers believe a reaper was responsible. The king was well liked by the guild, his desire for progress amongst different groups admirable. However, now that his son is in charge, the guild may have much more difficulty in convincing him of their need for equality. Therefore, the guild may as well be hunting the reapers to discover who is responsible for the regression. How many reapers are there? Hannah felt a fear grow within her. If she was to be queen, she may encounter a reaper who may have been sent to kill her. She was an outsider after all, and if Hexfer was correct and the royal court wanted the queen to remain uninvolved in their affairs, well, she had already exceeded her boundaries by asking about the contents of the amendment. The expression the royal advisor had given her still sent chills up her spine. No one knows how many there are because they often live like ordinary citizens. Most sorcerers live in communities amongst themselves, but the reapers, being cast out by both society and sorcerers alike, often choose to live secretly as ordinary townspeople. But if they live secretly, how can you be sure? Sierre locked eyes with Hannah. He smiled. You are a very curious being, Sierre stated, taking a moment of silence before continuing. I know many people from all walks of life. When one is on good terms with one reaper, one is on good terms with many reapers. Not that I'm proud of my relationship with the reapers, but even when one disagrees with the practice of another, it does not mean they cannot see eye to eye on some points. Hannah grinned at this statement, which seemed the problem with many who cling to such discriminatory views, but she could not help but feel her nerves start up. She found difficulty swallowing. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, reapers work for others. Yes. They don't act on their own. Not usually. So, theoretically, they assassinated the king as a job, meaning someone paid them to do it. Yes, that is more than likely the case. Sierre gazed up at Hannah, who appeared deep in concentration, From her questions, he assumed he understood the many thoughts swarming her, fears likely accompanying them. He knew not how to comfort her without including an optimistic, dishonest statement he would not be able to support. The two heard the sound of doors opening, the townspeople exiting their houses and looking up to the sky. Joyous cries resounded as families and friends celebrated the extinction of the darkness and the disease. Those who were once infected shouted grateful prayers toward the heavens, blessing the prince, cursing the sorcery. Not even 10 minutes had passed before the townspeople returned to their normal lives, gossiping with their neighbors and heading to the market district to finish their interrupted work or unfinished shopping. Hannah stood there, paralyzed. She looked around at the other faces and didn't understand how they could be so happy. The issue had not been dealt with, simply withdrawn for the time being. Hexfer and the Reaper were still alive, still willing to cause chaos and suffering at the expense of others. She felt more vulnerable now than she had before. Perhaps this was due in part to the fact that she hadn't been infected, therefore didn't understand the risks of losing her life. But now that she learned of this dark side and underground to politics, her future appeared much grimmer. Seer never moved his eyes from Hannah. He had known many who fell on hard times, some sufferings greater than others. Yet Hannah's vacant expression caused a pity in him he didn't know he possessed. Not that he's more familiar with apathy, but that he couldn't understand what caused him to feel for her to such a depth. "Hannah!" Hannah turned to the direction she heard her name called. As she rotated, she was almost knocked off her feet by her mother, who tightly embraced her. Hannah noticed tears streaming down her mother's face, and couldn't help but feel her own eyes begin to water. Hannah wrapped her arms tightly around her mother, the environment fading to the background. "Hannah, you're okay, thank God. You're not hurt, are you? We got here as soon as we could. Oh, I love you so much. Don't ever run off again," her mother cried. Hannah didn't know if it was herself, her mother, or both of them trembling as they stood there, but she no longer cared. She was tired of feeling pressured to hide her emotions and thoughts for fear of being judged. Perhaps she wasn't beautiful or intelligent or brave, but she didn't mind. Simplicity is what she desired. Hannah and her mother pulled apart, locking eyes with one another in an affirmation that everything was going to be all right. Hannah rotated her head to see Van and Jasper stumbling up the path, Van wearing a slightly oversized blue cloak. Hannah laughed, surprised her mother allowed it. Many passerby looked in disapproval, but none of the group cared for their status or their honor at this time. "Van," Hannah called, smiling all the while, "it really suits you." Van returned the smile. Jasper rushed to Seer's side, his face expressing a blanket of social anxiety and paranoia being within the town's walls. Seer stood with some assistance, and after a few seconds he had his balance within his control. The infection faded and the bleeding stopped. They stood in a circle for a moment, examining one another's faces. Suddenly, the sound of trumpets erupted in the air, followed by the trotting of horses and rolling of carriage wheels along the stone street. The townspeople moved out of the way of the procession, but quickly circled around to see what was happening. A train of people followed the carriage from wherever they were when they first heard it. The emblem of a snake wrapped around a crown was painted onto the carriage door. The carriage stopped in front of the group. A footman jumped down from beside the driver of the carriage. He dropped the steps and opened the door. Down from the carriage stepped the prince and his royal adviser, one who wore a face of relief, the other a face of suppressed rage. Hannah tried her best not to lock eyes with the royal adviser, feeling that if she did, her life may end then and there. The prince gallantly strode to Hannah's side, grabbing her hand and taking a knee. His blue eyes met hers, his charming grin causing all women nearby to swoon, her own mother included. Hannah's breath grew shallow. She wanted to turn her head, but the voices in her mind forced her not to move her eyes. The royal adviser present in her peripheral vision. She didn't know if she'd rather know he was there or not. "Thank the highest heavens you are not hurt, my lady. This is your family, I presume. None of them have been hurt, have they?" Hannah had been friends with Nina long enough to see through his theatrics. She knew he did not have any special feelings for her. He said it himself. She's normal. Simple. Hannah understood the act was to preserve his reputation and greater his influence, playing as his adviser had taught him. "We're all fine," Hannah responded, forcing a smile. She had forgotten the pain of acting as if nothing were wrong. The prince rose and walked to her mother, kissing her hand in respect. Her mother flashed a wide grin, but her eyes automatically glanced back to Hannah, who stared at the ground, her eyes empty. When Hannah raised her head, she noticed the royal advisor glaring past her. The prince, his behavior similar to his visor, began to step toward the two sorcerers, cautiously, for he was well aware of who they were. "I recognize you from the ball," the prince stated in a soft voice, so that only those nearby could hear. The prince wore a wicked grin, eyeing Seer up and down as if attempting to intimidate. Seer, realizing the prince only sought to incriminate him, stepped back and bowed his head, wearing a solemn expression. "I apologize for entering uninvited," Seer responded. Hannah felt a strange sensation course through her. Seer appeared defeated, passive, and weak. Not weak by means of physical strength, which he was recovering from the events from before, but weak of heart, as if he cared not to defend himself, whether by actions or words. Seer glanced at her, as if he heard her thoughts, but quickly turned his head back to the ground, closing his eyes. "You are well aware that you broke the law?" the prince said in a voice of authority. "Yes, your majesty." "You are also aware that I could have you executed as punishment, yes?" "Yes, your majesty." But, your majesty," Jasper began, his head bowed as he slowly stumbled closer to the two. He has done no wrong." "He entered my castle without my permission, therefore he has done a great wrong." Hannah watched the scene unfold in agony. She wished to stop it, for it to be over, but so many people stood to witness the shame and dishonor if she would stand up for a sorcerer, squandering the name of the prince, her fiancé no less. Her mother may never be able to look at her again. Hannah thought she was through with caring what others thought of her, but she had only claimed so in a time of strength. She was weak. Abandoning old habits that seemed chained to her being was not something she would overcome with a brief flash of individuality. Hannah's mouth slightly opened, but she heard a shrewd whisper over her shoulder. "Say nothing." The words paralyzed her. She no longer believed Hexfer to be the image of her nightmares. The replacement could be none other than the royal advisor. Hexfer's presence may have been one of hostility, but with the presence of the advisor behind her, Hannah felt like death itself stood at her doorstep. "Tell me, old man, are you pleased that your little disease was on the verge of wiping out the entire population of Wickborough? Innocent women and children." "We didn't," Seer started before being interrupted. "I was not finished. Old man, do you truly believe the best way to fight for your cause is through violence and cruelty?" The prince was now shouting his statements for all around to hear. The crowd cheered in agreement with him, a few throwing curses at the sorcerers. Whoa, Jasper attempted. "Silence! Your vileness will no longer taint this kingdom." The people cheered once more. "Those who commit such crimes will be held accountable, and the only punishment fit for such a terrorist is execution." The prince removed a saber from the hilt at his side. The thin, curved blade shone with the sun's rays bouncing back to the heavens, or perhaps the glint shone from the flames under their feet. The mood had changed, the air following suit. The charming prince stood as a hard-hearted knight, one with retribution alight in his eyes, retribution for killing a sorcerer, the same race that had killed his father. Hannah's hands moved to her mouth, her eyes watering. Even her mother and Van were shocked by his declaration and action. The prince brought his sword to Seer's throat, resisting the urge to draw blood from a slight cut of intimidation. Hannah felt released from the force that once held her in place and rushed to the prince. She threw herself to the ground and kissed the street beneath him. As she sat up, still staring at the ground, which now had drops of water puddled along it, Hannah begged, "Please, let them go. Send them away. Never let them return, but don't kill them." The prince looked at her in shock before peering at the two sorcerers, who seemed to mirror his expression. They, too, looked at Hannah in astonishment, not aware of how to react to her defense of them. They had understood the punishments and the risks, never expecting anyone to stand up for them, especially in conference with the prince. The crowd, spreading word of what Hannah said, booed and cursed at her, most of them not knowing she was the soon-to-be queen. The prince held up his hand to silence them. Sheathing his saber, he knelt down beside Hannah and lifted her chin so they could connect eyes. Hannah wrapped her arms around the one he used to support her chin and attempted to talk to the deepest, most merciful portion of his soul. "Please," Hannah pleaded. They shared a silence. The sound of the royal advisor's footsteps against the pavement pulled their attention. He stopped next to the two. "I believe your queen is correct, your majesty," the royal advisor said. Hannah turned to him in shock, wondering why he was acting in such a way. "You don't want to appear as a barbarian to the townspeople. No matter their spirits about it in this moment, you cannot be the aggressor." The prince took Hannah's hand, and the two rose to their feet. The prince continued to gaze at his advisor, while Hannah's gaze moved to Seer and Jasper. Jasper was attempting to silently and subtly communicate his thanks to Hannah, but Seer stood with his eyes closed. Hannah felt her free hand grow in pain as she anxiously dug her fingernails into her palm. The situation was almost averted, but she would not feel better until Seer and Jasper were safely outside of town. "Perhaps you are correct," the prince responded, after thinking over his advisor's points. The prince turned to the two sorcerers and, maintaining his air of authority, dismissed them. "I will allow you this leave due to your protection of my queen, but know this. If you return, you will be under close surveillance, and any further infractions of the law will result in suitable punishment." "I would expect no less, your majesty," Seer responded. He turned his back without ever looking at them. He picked up his cloak and wrapped it about himself before walking toward the town gate. "Thank you, your majesty," Jasper said, before stumbling after Seer. The two walked back to the cabin without looking back. Those who were gathered around whispered their curses at the two sorcerers, wearing disgusted looks on their faces all the while. The excitement was over, yet they continued to stand there, waiting to see what the prince would do or say next. "Come," the prince said, leading Hannah by the hand to the carriage. "We shall go to the castle and celebrate our kingdom's triumph over evil." The crowd cheered. This made Hannah start to wonder what they would not cheer for. "Please, Mrs. Baker, Mr. Baker," referring to Hannah's mother and brother, "join us in our feast. Perhaps we should get to discussing the wedding ceremony." Hannah's mother smiled and curtsied before grabbing Van's hand and pulling him towards the carriage. The royal advisor held out his hand to assist the two as they climbed inside. His face expressed an obviously feigned friendliness, his grin appearing more deceitful than benevolent. "Are you ready to go, my queen?" the prince asked, his charming tone seeming ever more like a chant. He positioned his arm at his side. "Yes, my king," she replied, softly sliding her arm between his and his side. Fortunately, Hannah had seen mannerisms of royalty when walking alongside one another. Otherwise, she wouldn't have known how to act. Once her arm rested on his, they began their walk to the carriage. He lifted his left arm and started to wave at the crowd, any woman he locked eyes with swooning. Hannah followed his lead, though she felt her arm and smile were stiff due to her anxiety. She had not realized the large number of people who had gathered around. When they reached the carriage steps, the royal advisor offered his hand. Hannah's eyes met his, and she swallowed, unknowing if she could accept his help, as if her survival instinct was telling her not to. For need of decency and status, she grabbed his hand and pushed herself into the carriage. "Be careful not to slip," the royal advisor stated, a predatory glimmer in his eyes. Hannah opened her mouth, but chose not to respond. The prince and lastly the advisor climbed into the carriage. They seated themselves on one side, Hannah and her family on the other, and the footman closed the door behind them. A loud cheer erupted as the carriage began to move. Hannah looked out the window of the carriage at all of the passing faces, none of them familiar to her now. They took the road into the market district, passing through on their way to the castle. People lined the street for the entire distance. As Hannah hopelessly watched the faces, she thought she recognized one of them, tears unwillingly beginning to form in her eyes. She stuck her head out the window, attempting not to lose sight of the face, but her efforts were futile, for the carriage continued to move farther away. The distance only increased, no matter how she stretched her neck. Pulling her head back into the carriage, she felt a gentle touch on her knee. Her mother's hand rested there, providing comfort and warmth, as if she could feel Hannah's grief. Her mother had been so excited when she first heard of her daughter being queen, but in this moment she appeared less than enthused.